Right. Has Andy come? Maura?
Not quite yet.
Okay. Shall I start with Tim then?
Yeah. Well, do you want to just do the poll first?
Yes. Have I not done so? I've mentioned the poll. To do the poll, please. The poll
Well, we're
question
going to look at
is
the
live.
answers to question 3.
I can't see anything other than the encouraging the design policies. I can only see the headings. I can't see the other one.
Can't see the results.
No, I can't see the results.
Well, we've only had 68% voted. So once we've got a few more voted, I'll end the poll and then you will be able to see the results.
Okay. Do you want to hold
So, yeah.
that poll open till after Tim has spoken?
Yeah, we'll leave the poll open so people can put their responses in.
Okay.
There is quite a lot of no's though for Tim's question.
Okay. You just tell me when you think it's appropriate to introduce Tim.
Now, ready to go.
Okay. So I'd like to introduce Tim Stonor to start the process going. Tim is Managing Director of Space Syntax, and he's an architect and urban planner who has devoted his career to the analysis and design of human behavioral patterns. The way in which people move, interact, and transact in buildings and urban places. He is an internationally recognized expert in the design of spatial layouts, and in particular, the role of space in the generation of social, economic, and environmental values. He's Managing Director of Space Syntax, created at the Bartlett in 1989, where I first met him actually, to develop and apply predictive design technologies. He's also a director at the Academy of Urbanism. So I'm going to hand over now to Tim.
Thanks, John. And thanks for that introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining. What I've got with me is a presentation today around active mobility. It's titled Designing for Active Mobility. And what I'd like to do in this is to share with you some new tools, new data-driven tools that we're developing for local authority planning officers to help in the creation of walking and cycling plans in towns and cities. I've also got with me some case studies from the past, and I've got some ideas at the end about where we might be going next with technology. And just to say thank you for the invitation to speak today. I've spoken at this forum once a few years previously and really enjoyed it. So please send me questions and comments, and I'll try and do my best to answer them. Where I want to start is with the core technology at the heart of Space Syntax's approach to urban planning and design. And that's a technology we call integrated urban modeling. It runs within a geographic information system. And what it does is it brings together data sets, many of which already exist, and some of which we then help to generate for our clients in the public and private sectors to address everyday questions down the left-hand side of this image about how many jobs are there nearby? How many can I get to conveniently, say within half an hour? Is there a decent school or doctor nearby? Am I going to be close to shops, cafes, open space? What's best for everyone as we plan the future? And thinking about existing places as well as urban extensions, as well as new settlements. And the way we build these integrated models is on the right-hand side by connecting data sets around two key issues. First, physical and spatial form, which I'll say a lot more about, but in general, it's around spatial connectivity, the network of streets and roads, public spaces. It's around public transport accessibility. So where are the bus stops? Where's the train station? What are the catchments, the walkable catchments from each? Can I cycle to them? And then the land use mix, that's going to be really important, as you're going to see. Are we just talking about housing, or is there a genuine mix of uses, and how can we measure all of this? Alongside those data sets, which are, in some ways think of them as inputs, are the outputs. What does the mix of connectivity, land use, and transport then create in terms of the outputs of mobility, the movement patterns, patterns of land value, data we find in the census about who's there, various forms of censuses of educational achievement, multiple deprivation, outputs in terms of air quality and biodiversity. We're interested in how what we do as inputs influences what then happens as outputs. And how can data help with all of this? And more than anything, how can we simplify it so that you don't need a PhD in GIS, computer coding, which I don't have, but how can these create everyday tools that are at our fingertips to inform the production of policy and the enactment of plans? Now, you may have seen space syntax before. We use a lot of spatial modeling around network analysis. So we can take the street network of a town, run an algorithm through that street network and identify the hierarchy of connectivity, which are the most connected, which are the least connected streets, in terms of how you get from everywhere to everywhere else, which are the routes that are more likely to be taken by people walking or cycling or driving. We can run the analysis at different scales of catchment to work out which are the best streets if you're just doing a short distance journey, or the best streets if you're doing a long distance journey. We color code this, we have numbers behind it. The hotter, the redder the street, the more connected it is. And we've discovered that this very simple way of analyzing space can powerfully predict many of those outcomes, and I'll show you some images of them. But what it really allows us to do is bring in a new scheme. So we can, in this next image, drop in a local, a plan, if you like, an urban plan for a place. We happen to be looking at Didcot. This is a piece of work from many years ago, but we can look at how the place is today, and we could look at how it would be in the future under various different scenarios. We can test different street connectivities. And as I'll show, we can address issues in terms of, well, which is the lowest carbon? Where should the school streets be? Where should the active travel corridors be? Where do you want to prioritize spend on creating, say, a cycling network? What kind of cycling network should be? So there are lots of other questions within this analysis, but in essence, at the beginning, it's what's the hierarchy of space? How do we understand the way places connect together? And space syntax for many years has been developing tools to do so. And this is an opportunity for me to acknowledge that this is the work of a large, fairly diverse team of people. Originally, as John said, out of University College London as a research group, now fully independent, employee-owned organization working around the world. And in doing so, working with a vision about thriving life. We don't just get out of bed to make money. We get out of bed to deliver thriving life. That's our mantra. How do we create the right balance of connectivity, of movement, awareness, encounter, exchange between people at every scale? And in practice, we are both supporting the plan making process. We're helping local authorities and private developers we're giving assistance to their master planning teams, and we're also leading the master planning process. So if there's time, I'll close this presentation with a description of a master plan for the capital city of Kazakhstan called Astana, where Space Syntax has led a multidisciplinary team to deliver a plan for the future of that place. We were very much helped in the promotion of this relatively new approach to urban planning and design back in the 1990s, working with Norman Foster on the redesign of Trafalgar Square. And the steps of Trafalgar Square are testament to an analytic process that focused on spatial connectivity and focused on another area that I may not do justice to, which is the observation of human behavior. I think, as Jan Gale said, we know more about the behavior of mountain gorillas than we do about ourselves, because we've studied mountain gorillas for decades, but we haven't really practiced the art of studying what real human beings do. There's a lot of planning theory, there's a lot of design theory about what we think people do. Most of it is wrong. I'm not even going to suggest that. I'm going to say that as fact, and I'll wait for someone to prove me otherwise. But most of what architects are taught in design school is wrong. The idea that people will walk around a corner for a delightful surprise is wrong. People fear what's around the corner more than they wait for the architect's delightful surprise, I suggest. So bringing this new research out of UCL into practice, working with the likes of Foster, helped to establish Space Syntax back in the 90s. As I say, spatial connectivity is at the heart of it. Why and how? Well, we learned very early on that the degree to which streets are physically connected, literally how many other cross connections they have, how straight or linear they are, how sinuous and direct they are, versus how indirect or labyrinthine, has a very tangible effect on human behavior. I won't go into the algorithm and the science today, but we're measuring nothing more than interconnectivity in street networks using very simple graph mathematics, but that generates a hierarchy within a network that we represent with colors, that when we then go out and count the numbers of people walking on the left, the numbers of people driving on the right, the highest levels of movement are on the most connected streets. It's not perfect, it's not a 100% correlation, but it's a 60% correlation for pedestrians, 70% for vehicles, which is usually way more than any conventional traffic model. So the single variable of space, low cost, very quick form of traffic modeling, that conventional modeling is about 50% right. Talking about new approaches to active mobility, I wanted to start here with shopping centers, not because I think shopping centers are the answer, far from it, but I think the pioneers in thinking differently about walking in particular in the early 2000s, the 2010s, were the shopping centers breaking the mold of inward-looking shopping centers and trying to create street-based shopping. They, covered streets, shopping malls as covered streets. Land Securities at Cardiff St. David's and the scheme in Oxford. And if we look around the planet, street-based shopping is the future, because the private sector has figured out that those highly enclosed, inward-looking, 45-degree offset shopping centres that pervade every English high street actually don't trade as well as the high street itself. Movement rates are typically lower in many of these places where the agents say, well, we want to trap people. We want to make it hard for them to get out. To which my rather obvious comment was, well, don't you therefore make it hard for them to get in? And I think that realization that the old way of trapping them in there and surrounding it with a car park is wrong, and the better way to do it is to connect with linear streets into existing urban centres. So working at Cardiff with Land Securities in Cardiff at St. David's, what we did was to begin the process of working on their site, the big asterisk in the middle, by counting the numbers of people currently walking around the outside of the site and getting to know the place. And I would really recommend this, very low cost, to create a pedestrian survey. Don't just survey the busy streets, which is the mistake that many authorities make. Survey the quiet streets, survey a whole area, get to know that different changes of direction lead to different movement levels, and get to understand how being close to the railway station increases them at certain times of the day, but not always, bus stops and so on. The magic of the space syntax approach is that by taking, well, it's not magic, it's mathematics. By taking street connectivity as the predictor of movement, you can build a model of the future very quickly and run the algorithm through the network, calculate the levels of connectivity of the proposal, and extrapolate from the survey to create the future predicted levels of movement, which we did. And from that, by aggregating them all up, we predicted 38 million people a year would use this center. In fact, 40 million people were using it in the first few years after opening, which was good to be on the slightly underside of a robust forecast. But this is a pedestrian movement modeling technique that we as a business have been providing. It's not, for me, it's great. It keeps our business going, but it's actually not enough. Our next step, which is what I will show you, is how we disseminate this to make it available to everyone without having to hire consultants like ourselves. Other aspects of this, which are worth noting, is that behind footfall is value. So I work with a lot of property developers. They're looking for not just everywhere to be busy, but to have major streets that are going to be high footfall places that then have behind them quieter streets where there's value in having, being able to hear the birds sing. What we have connected our spatial modeling technique to is underlying land value. So what you're looking at here is Darwin in the Northern Territory, Australia. And what we have is an urban value model that has linked the degree of street connectivity, the directness of the route, the interconnectivity of it, to the existing land values, such that we can predict in this future scenario $3.7 billion dollars of land value increase, both in the urban extension that we were designing and in the existing city. We've developed this technique further recently working in Melbourne, where, as well as spatial layout attraction, the connectivity of the street, we've been able to incorporate land use attraction, the presence of retail in particular, and transport attraction. Really, really telling to see how being close to a tram stop in Melbourne has a very clear multiplier on land value levels. As well as being able to have intelligent conversations with land value surveyors, what these techniques have then allowed us to do is work with the urban design team in the city of Melbourne and develop proposals for a new set of connections across the city, one of which is a bridge across the tracks between the CBD of the city and Docklands, which looks like this. This is a bridge, but because our model identified the significant urban value uplift potential, we were able to then say, well, the next step is not just to make it a bridge, but to make it a living bridge lined with mixed use, slow mobility, bringing that tram line into the new development site, enhancing, multiplying the values that we would create, providing, as you can see, cycle routes, and doing so with a form of landscape that is linear, a linear landscape that extends the city seamlessly between one part and the other. Now, all of these lessons we've been trying to then scale up it back in the UK into a national spatial model, which we released a number of years ago. And this provides a quick look at the spatial connectivity levels of every part of Great Britain, and we've recently added Northern Ireland. And it's called the Open Mapping Platform. So if you Google Space Syntax Open Mapping, you'll find a site that allows you to zoom in on any part of the country and get a reading of its levels of spatial connectivity. I'll come on to why that might be useful in a moment and what we've done with that next. But to give you an example, we've further developed the open mapping into a walkability index by incorporating within the national model not only the degree of street connectivity, but the degree of transport attraction. So we've linked the spatial network of the UK, and as you can see, of the Republic of Ireland. In England, Wales, and Scotland, we've now linked in the transport network. So we've got every train station and every bus stop such that we can switch on and off the attraction of those facilities. And we've linked in the transport timetable, so we know how frequent services are running on buses or trains across the country. We've also linked in the land use registry so that we have every single plot, every single land use coming from land registry data. So we've taken the space syntax data set that we've built and we've added in Department of Transport, land registry data that's already in the public domain to create a walkability index. And what the walkability index does is it takes the land use map of a place, which you probably all be familiar with. I've got two case studies here. The settlement of Poundbury on the left and the settlement of Bradley Stoke on the right. Poundbury, the Duchy of Cornwall, deliberately mixing land uses, putting jobs close to where people live, putting shops close to where people live. Bradley Stoke, typical house builders, 1980s development, lots of housing with a supermarket stuck in the corner surrounded by a car park. And the interest being, how can you measure this a bit more accurately in terms of walkability, and how can you link that to land value? The walkability index takes each building and measures from it a catchment of 5 minutes or 10 minutes, depending upon how you choose, and measures how many shops are within a 5-minute walk of where you are. Not a crow fly journey, but a down through the grid journey, whether you're near a school, whether you're near a place of employment. And by mashing together the various different catchments, it produces a simple color scale, and behind it a number from 1 to 100 that allows us to give every building in the country a walkability index. That more clearly, I think, draws out the difference between Poundbury and Bradley Stoke. Poundbury very much following the historic model that we can see in places like Clifton in Bristol on the left here, or where I am today, Faversham in Kent on the right, where because of the inherent street connectivity, the seamless direct linkage of the grid, the intensity of land use diversity, and the density of dwellings themselves, you get throughout the historic record up until the invention of the car, naturally high walkability indexes. If you link these to rateable value, we're seeing, and here we're working with Knight Frank, very clear correlations between the rateable value of settlements and their walkability score. What this, we think, should encourage policymakers to do is to set standards of walkability when they're creating local plans, and say that a plan must have a certain walkability threshold on the basis that, and in order to do so, it will need a degree of street connectivity, a degree of dwelling density, and really importantly, proper mixed use land uses. Just 1 or 2 shops is not enough. We're seeing that all the places that really deliver value, that are really walkable, have very significant levels of land use mix. So we can take a whole city like Edinburgh and build its accessibility to bus stops, accessibility to the rail station, and combine those to create a public transport index, and then link that back to the land registry, bring in the land uses and create the walkability index, whether that's Edinburgh, whether it's Greater London. Now, where I want to go next, and I realize I'm going at a pace, but I want to get through and make sure that I cover everything in time. But what we're also looking at with these modeling techniques are issues that relate to the carbon footprint of places. We're currently working on a zero carbon tool with the Connected Places Catapult that we hope will, and I haven't got it to show you today, but soon be able to measure the transport carbon footprint of a new settlement on the basis of everything I've talked about, that you can have the most thermally insulated buildings on the planet, but if they are part of a disconnected residential only settlement that's car dependent, you're actually creating a huge carbon footprint through the mobility part. That's maybe for another day. But by linking census data on propensity to drive with spatial accessibility data on grid connectedness, we can see very clearly you're much less likely to travel to work by car or van if you live in a more walkable place. Equally, again, just taking Oxford, but equally, you're much more likely to have very good health if you're living in a connected walkable place. And we're trying to look across the record to make sure we're not just looking at relatively wealthy places like the centre of Oxford, where people might be able to afford to do certain things more than others. We're looking across a range of settlements. For example, in Exeter, we've been working with the local authority, giving them our model with a bit of training, and they've done their own data analysis to demonstrate correlations with obesity and spatial accessibility. The less accessible you are, the more likely you are to be obese. Mental health is the other key component of the health equation. Working in Milton Keynes and the areas around, we've been working with Age UK, who have a model of social isolation, loneliness, and by linking their model of loneliness with our model of car dependence, we've been able to, again, identify the patterns. And this, I think, is not only a really important finding with big implications for maybe how you overcome this by providing transport to people who are aged, unable to drive, but living in a place where they're car dependent and they're no longer able to drive their car. So how do you maybe target transportation services to help them get out, socialize, do what they need to do? But it's also the case that I think data science of this kind is very much the future of local authority planning, and having school skills in this area is going to be, I would say, a necessity in the next decade, because the local authorities that aren't doing this, I don't think, are capturing the potential that's now available from what I've described as those publicly available data sets and the new data sets that organizations like mine are now sharing in to the public record. So the more we look at space, the more we look at spatial connections, the more we link that to social, economic, and environmental impacts, the more that we're seeing connections. To which end, we've been setting ourselves the challenge of, well, how can we disseminate some of this information? And we've recently completed a pilot study for a web-based tool aimed at local authority planning officers, which we're calling the Active Travel Explorer. And the aim of the Active Travel Explorer is to be a starting point for conversations in local authorities about the creation of active mobility networks, walking, cycling networks. How do you identify the routes that you should prioritize spend against? How do you consider multiple complex factors simultaneously? Where are the schools? Can you create school streets? What speeds should you be designing for? How do existing patterns of job location relate to existing patterns of house location? And how can you plan for the future? So I just want to share some slides with you of what the Active Travel Explorer looks like. This is a phase 1 pilot that we've recently completed, funded by the Geospatial Commission through Innovate UK, where we've partnered with Kent County Council, we've partnered with Exeter county and district councils. And I'd be very interested in feedback, because we're keen to move this to stage 2 to bid into the next phase of funding for this. We're looking for partners to do so. So what does the Active Travel Explorer do? It begins, so it's web-based, and it, as you can see top left, from 1 to 7, it's intended to take users on a journey step by step through the process of creating an active travel strategy. If you choose, you can choose to switch off the autopilot and go and explore the data on your own, in which case it won't take you on that linear sequence. It's a website that's available now, which is why I put the address up there, so you can Google it. Don't do it now, listen to me. Active Travel Explorer. And it begins with a tick box exercise to say, let's just be really clear what we're trying to achieve here. What are the target transport modes that we're looking to increase? What kind of impacts and benefits are we looking to create? What's our business case that we're looking to generate? How are we going to measure the outcomes of this? How will we measure them? And who will measure them? Because the creation of an active travel network is a multi-department, multi-discipline exercise, and we need to bring departments together. We need to bring different parts of the same department together. We need to be able to work with elected members, as well as officers, as well with consultants, and of course with the local community. So that's where we start. Taking Exeter as our case study, we've brought, first of all, together in our step 2, active commuting levels based on census data. So we're representing from people over 50% travel being done through active modes in green, down to less than 20% in red. You can see that the county is dominated by people traveling less than 20% by active modes. We can then move through the map and zoom in on any place. I've chosen Exeter city itself, but it's a map. You can scroll it around, move in, move out, and see that data again at a city or even a local area level, and then ask questions of it. So let's think about the origins of journeys. Where is the working age population? We know we have that information from census data. The darker the red, the more working age population. Where are the jobs? So where people live and where they work, what kind of commute is that then setting up is what's behind this stage. This is land registry data. We're just bringing it in. And then doing the same thing for schools. Where's the school age population, and where then are the destinations in terms of school locations? I'm going to move quickly through this because there's a lot to go through and you can explore it yourself. But we then bring in the Walkability Index work that I showed earlier to say, how is the city currently supporting walking and cycling? If you mash together those data sets of where the jobs are, where the schools are, where people are living, and where the streets are, you can generate which parts of the city are more walkable and which are less, based on where the attractors are, where the origins are. We knew from the census where people are or are not taking active modes, where they are or are not walking or cycling. And therefore, what we've done here is to layer together, where is the city actually quite good for walking, but where are people not walking? So that we can then perhaps zoom in on an area and ask why. Why is it that in this area, there's plenty of opportunity, origins and destinations for walking, but the walking isn't happening? Is that to do with, say, the local urban design of the place? The traffic is moving too quickly. There isn't a footway, there isn't a cycleway. We can start asking questions in this layer. And the Active Travel Explorer then makes a proposal. It says, based on what I know about street connectivity, about origins and destinations, this is the principal network of routes that it recommends to become the active travel network for that area. The Department for Transport has a grid density requirement where it says if you're going to invest in creating a cycling network, there shouldn't be any part of it longer than 500 meters, I think it is, without an intersection. The Active Travel Explorer looks at that and looks for those places where it says there should be, based on the information that we fed into it, but which might not comply with the DFT guidance. What we're finding is the DFT guidance is good, but doesn't cover everywhere. Some places, because there's a large open space, there's going to be a greater than 500 meter segment length. And that allows you to have specific conversations as to why you should be making an exception to the rules at that point. Not only where should the active travel network be, but what sort of cycle network should it be? For example, should it be fully segregated cycling, or should it just be a slow speed part of town where you want to allow cycling to mix with other traffic and mix with pedestrians? Why? Because there might be a place in town with lots of pedestrians, or there might be a very low speed environment or a very narrow street, as I'm finding where I live here in Faversham, where you simply physically cannot put in segregated cycling. So because we have knowledge of street condition, the Travel Explorer is able to identify. So if you go to the heart of Exeter, where we expect there to be very high levels of cycling, then we're saying these are places where you don't want to have, very high levels of pedestrian movement. These are places where you don't want to have segregated, high curbed cycle lanes that will interrupt the movement of pedestrians. So let's, horses for courses, let's put the right kind of infrastructure in the right place. The Explorer brings in the data on traffic speed, which is available through the Ordnance Survey, to again be able to fine tune where are there places where we're seeing excessive speed, or where do we know speeds are low enough already to be able to put these measures in without perhaps extensive traffic surveys of speed, and so on and so on. There are many layers which we're using at the moment to have conversations with Exeter, with Kent, with our partners, to try to fine tune this to officers' needs. Where do we expect there to be more pedestrian flow? This is one technique for very rapidly forecasting pedestrian volumes. And of course, because we have this as a national data set, we can identify this not just for the city centre, but for the wider area, indeed the whole of the county. We can create a targeted suite of interventions that are the beginnings, as I say, of the conversation. They identify where the active travel network might be, and then they allow the conversation as to, well, let's look a bit closer at this to try and understand some of the details and nuances that would be the next stage. And we're being told that getting to this stage is a really helpful stage in just being able to open up conversations and base them on data. John, I'm conscious of the time. I think I might have about 5 minutes to go, which would allow me to just run through one last case study, but do interrupt me, otherwise I'll just give you 5 more minutes.
That's fine. No, that's okay. Go for it. Go for it.
And the place I wanted to finish is in Kazakhstan, of course, because it allows me to talk about where we might go with these techniques next. One of my big concerns is that, as I mentioned earlier, architectural education, and I hesitate about town planning education because I've only been educated as an architect, but architectural education has very little in it about the human being. And that's, I think, why we've made so many mistakes around how we have designed towns and cities in the 20th century. I think the prevalence of the motor car is another factor that the town planning profession, as well as architecture, has allowed to happen in very negative ways for our towns and cities. So we're looking at space syntax to how can we develop design tools that automate the process of design in order to not quite take the architect out of it, but perhaps take the architect out of it. So I want to share with you the scheme that we produced for our competition submission for the master planning of Nur Sultan, which is the capital city of Kazakhstan. It's a competition that we won, and then have gone on to produce a plan for. But in this proposal, which ultimately is around connected streets and spaces, mixed land uses, slow speed movement, I haven't mentioned 20-mile-an-hour limits, I don't think, but for me, that's the beginning in all of this, slow speed environments, which you can then build other policies around. So here in Faversham, just jumping away from Astana for a moment, we're now working on the LC WIP, the local cycling walking infrastructure plan, but we put the last 5 years into getting the whole town to 20 miles an hour, because we know when we've got it at 20 miles an hour, all the transport rules become much easier, the solutions become more affordable. So this scheme was very much in that ilk from the beginning. You're looking at boulevards and tall buildings, but they're all set into a 20 mile an hour, 30 kilometers an hour speed limit. Now, we began the process of design thinking, well, how could we use data to use artificial intelligence to grow a city in the way that you might, grow a mold in a petri dish? How could you grow a city overnight? By taking some of these rules and letting the computer do it for you, because it might then do it according to some of those good principles that we've identified about connected streets, walkable grids, mixed land use. So we took the existing city of Astana and we, first of all, identified that the best direction for growth was to the south and east. Many reasons for this: the direction of the wind, the avoidance of extreme flooding, and avoidance of some important agricultural quality land. But in doing so, we had to accept that there were some risks of noise pollution, the takeoff and landing cone of the airport, and the noise from the motorway that you can see arcing around at the bottom of the screen. Okay, we accept those. They become places perhaps to avoid significant development. We also have flood risk, which at the same time is an opportunity if we can control the flood risk. Living on water, the benefit of being close to water, the value that water adds was something to be aware of. So that became a factor in our analysis. Within the site itself, we have some particularly sensitive areas of landscape, stands of trees, high quality soils that we wanted also to preserve as far as possible. So that gave us a development index with more developable land in red, less developable land in yellow. Now, in connecting that new urban extension back to the existing city, we ran a spatial network analysis to identify the links that were pointing at the site and the points of gateway into the site that would be the natural joins between new and old, and that we would want to latch onto, link into, so that we could plug the new into the old, and it wouldn't compete, it would work as one. We then trained an algorithm using an agent-based tool to identify the simplest routes between all of those gateways that avoided the sensitive soils and land and environmental issues, that avoided the negativity of the acoustic. And we ran some exercises to identify and simplify that principal network of streets. So in the master planning process, our approach is to identify the primary street network, the foreground grid of main streets, around which we could then develop ideas for the secondary grid based on other algorithms that made larger grid blocks where it was more residential, smaller grid blocks where it was more commercial, because permeability should be adjusted according to the amount of movement. More granular where there's more movement, less granular where there's less, so that all streets are active all of the time and therefore safe through natural surveillance. We could then locate principal commercial areas in red, retail, office, employment uses on these main boulevards, the principal dense, high density residential uses, and then the lower density residential uses of the garden villas. That gave us our plan, and that gave us a set of proposals to link through public transport back to the existing city. In the master plan itself, just in closing, we've gone right into the detail of how this place could work and used analytics in order to measure how these proposals are likely to impact on some very high level objectives that were set by working with the mayor of the city and the city officers for a livable city, a sustainable city, and a healthy city, such that by the end of the process, we could numerically score this scheme against those objectives to assess the degree to which we were delivering on the ambitions of the plan. So I hope what I've given today is a sense of how digital can be helpful, how it might be helpful in the immediate terms, in terms of maps that you can zoom in and out of and look at connectivity, how what's coming soon is the Active Travel Explorer, and that where we're going is the process of automating this, which we think is principally important for parts of the world that don't have planning infrastructures and design infrastructures, but might also be useful back home too. I'll pass back to you now, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. That's really good. We've got a couple of questions which I think might be appropriate to have at this particular moment in time. And they are initially about aspects of crime, about crime index, about anti-social behavior issues, about whether too connected an environment actually leads to a rise in criminality, and so on and so forth. So that's one that I think might be worth following through on. And the second one was really about availability. Is the Walkability Index available? Is the Active Travel Explorer available?
Yeah, so in terms of
yes,
in terms of the Active Travel Explorer, you can visit that site right now. I'll even paste in the chat the URL so that you can see what we've prepared for Exeter. The next phase is to, we hope, win funding to roll that out for the rest of the country, and the business model would be to provide a license to local authorities to use in the way that they use other tools. The Walkability Index is available and it's being sold commercially. So we're working with local authorities to sell them tiles of their particular authority and the data behind those tiles. It's much easier working with the public sector because of Ordnance Survey license agreements, harder working with the private sector. And the open mapping tool is already free and open and available. Again, I'll put a URL in that. So we're trying to provide this at a no cost or a low cost format.
And do you have to have special training? Do you have to have special training for this? Does someone in the local authority need to be the holder of the key, if you like, to those programs?
Not really. The aim of the Active Travel Explorer is to provide a platform that can be used immediately by anyone, because it takes you through that process. What's behind it are analyses and algorithms that people can be trained to understand but don't need to. And we're providing training to local authority officers and others in the technicalities of what I've shown. But actually, the Active Travel Explorer is intentionally aimed at a low barrier for training. Equally, the Walkability Index, it's a highly graphic depiction of how places are or aren't walkable. If you want to then go to the next stage of saying, well, why and what do we then do, then there's training for that. In terms of crime, I think the first thing to say on crime is it's a really, really complex subject. We've done a lot of work on this, and what we're finding is there's typically 7 different factors or 8 different factors. Design factors: street connectivity, are buildings facing the street or not? Is the front door facing the street or not? is there a high fence or a low fence between the street and the front door? Lighting, land use mix. Of those, if one of them is negative and the others are all positive, you can have a crime problem. So I'll just say that as a big caveat at the beginning. That said, what's consistent is that street connectivity plays a role in this. And so I think there was a comment there about, I mentioned something about delight and surprise and turning the corner. If you start from zero and just start designing a place from scratch, the last thing you want to design is a labyrinth. The best thing that you would be designing, the first thing you should aim for is a connected grid. That doesn't mean regular 90 degrees. It just means generally there's a small number of very straight main streets, and there's a much larger number of short streets, but that generally there's a grid that you can connect to, so that as you're walking down a street, you've got more than one way out. And I think that does respond to risk and threat, but it also generates on those main streets the thriving life of a community. That's where the shops are, that's where the urban buzz is, and then in those back streets, that's where the quietness of a residential area is.
Thanks. Okay, thank you very much, Tim. I hope you can hang on just for a little bit longer, just in case there are other Q&As. Introduce Andy von Bradsky now. Andy, I hope you're here. You are, excellent, lovely to see you. Okay.
I am here indeed.
Good. Andy von Bradsky is the head of architecture in Housing Supply Directorate of the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. He's an architect with over 30 years experience in design and delivery of housing in public and private sectors. He works across the planning, housing supply and standards directorates, as we said, and other government departments on architecture and design quality matters. This areas of expertise he's got in housing design, master planning and sustainability also includes working with communities. And he's been responsible for the overseeing of the National Design Guides and the National Model Design Codes and guidance recently published by government. He used to be director of PRP, which is where I first met him some time ago. And now we've got also the poll results. This is just to give you a little bit more background. Design coding is a new idea. Do we have enough design understanding? And actually, it's interesting that a majority of people feel that either maybe or no, they don't have understanding of the design coding process. So that's something that people either in local authority or government need to think about. Is your local authority getting ready to go to the new design coding initiative? Again, I'd say that, well, it looks like at least 50%, if not a little bit more, say maybe or no, and quite a lot don't knows. And have you advanced digital technologies in planning and forecasting for developments? And there, the answers seem to be definitely not. This is why I think the questions about availability of these web-based tools was about. So that's something that maybe you need to take up, you in the audience need to take up with your local authorities. Okay, thank you very much for that. And we're not prepared in the way that we should be. And Andy is going to tell us a little bit more about how we probably could be a little bit better in what we do. Andy, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. And firstly, my apologies if there was any mix-up in timings and so forth, but I'm here now and very pleased to be speaking to you all. I'm going to share my screen with a PowerPoint presentation, and really interesting hearing that sort of background to audience views about coding and so on. So can you see that, John?
Yeah, we can. Yes, that's fine.
I'll just put it on big screen.
Yes, put it on full screen. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for that introduction, John. And I have to say, really good to see you again after quite some time, I would say. Yeah, a lot of water under the bridge since PRP, and I've spent now 5 years, believe it or not, at the ministry advising, firstly as a consultant and then appointed formally as a civil servant, which was certainly never my career intention, but good to have been there and done the work that I've been doing. So the planning, the chief planner at the time, Steve Quartermain, asked me to focus on design quality in the planning system. And so I'm delighted to be able to talk to you about that today. I realise that your focus has been a little bit more on movement and connectivity. So I'm going to be talking about the design work that we've done and how that's bedded in planning policy as guidance, but also just drawing out some of those issues about movement and connectivity that might be in the guide and the code work. But I will give a bit more of a fulsome sort of explanation of coding. You might already have had some of this given to you at other presentations. I know David Rudlin at Urbed presented at some point, so apologies for those who might see this as a bit of a repeat performance. But I think given the importance government now places on coding, I don't think there's anything amiss in going back over that ground. I mean, I just wanted to start by talking about quality of place and space. Government really serious about this particular issue and has been for a while now, and clearly it commissioned the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, which reported Living with Beauty over a year ago now. And in January this year, the Minister made his formal response to that, which included, of course, lots of changes to guidance and policy and strengthening quality in the planning system, which I'll come on to talk about. But I think the first thing to say is, why are we doing this? I mean, clearly there is a deficit in quality in many of our places. We've got some of the best designers in the world, world-class architects and urban designers, and yet we still manage to produce poor quality schemes, which are illustrated here. The housing design audit that was carried out by CPRE and Place Alliance really painted quite a run picture of much of what we build in the country. And the issue for me is, how do we improve quality generally and lift the bar? So the good so the bad is good, and the good better, and that we work more towards exemplar housing rather than just the norm. The audit actually was very interesting in finding out where the deficits were, and I have to say, streets design, spaces between buildings, that whole issue around car parking, the environmental impacts of poor quality public space was one of the key features of that housing audit. So just to bring that out, and also the difference in areas around the country that had the quality differences between different parts of the country. So that's a sort of bit of background, really. You know, we know this, so what are we doing about it? And government has started to address these particular issues in the NPPF, and the current round of changes to the NPPF actually brings out quality as a much stronger emphasis, and puts perhaps quality as one of the strategic aims alongside quantity of new homes within the NPPF framework now. we are reviewing the responses to that. There have been quite a lot of support, well, lots of support for the changes, but also some consultation responses, which we're going through now. But effectively, the planning framework allows for the local authorities to place quality right up there in the planning system. Planning practice guidance has been published back in October 18, sorry, which actually sets out certain aspects in terms of design process and tools, the use of design review, the tools that are needed to measure and community engagement in that process. The National Design Guide, which I have presented already to this group in times when we could do face-to-face. So that is a significant a document now. And now recently the issue of the National Model Design Code and Guidance Notes. And given the continuity from one document to another, I think it's really important to stress that all of these need to be read together. There isn't one single document which embraces all of it. It needs to be worked through. And it is material consideration in planning decisions. It carries weight. It's emphasised in the NPPF now, and it is a tool that local authorities can and should be using to determine local policy. The objectives clearly set out in the National Design Guide and the code work, really creating health, environmental issues, green, sustainable, distinctive and connected, I would say, places which have a consistent high quality. So National Design Guide sets out those 10 characteristics, and they need to be applied locally according to local circumstances. I rather sort of unashamedly borrowed from Cambridge's review panel, the climate, character and community as a sort of a basis. Somewhat puzzlingly didn't include connected as one of the issues, because I think that clearly is a key issue, although movement is one of the key 10 characteristics within that. What we have been doing as part of the work on quality is meeting different departments within government, so DFT, DEFRA, BEIS, Home Office, have all been involved very closely in making sure that the requirements sort of meet or match their expectations in terms of policy and guidance. So we all know that Manual for Streets is being reworked by WSP under the direction of DFT and CIHT at the moment. So a really good piece of work to bring that up to date and to bring it much more in line with current thinking. And our coding work is trying to ensure that we don't preempt what that might be saying, and that we're complementary to it. Gear change, clearly the active travel principles will be embedded in the coding work, as too will the environmental bill requirements and green infrastructure. So what we try to do is make sure that we're following the theme, the trend in terms of other government guidance and departments. It's worth mentioning that in the National Design Guide itself, we do anticipate or ask local authorities, if you like, to anticipate change. And we are in a rather sort of existential existence at the moment, where climate change, change in demographics, the post-pandemic implications for design, technological change, real systemic change in the use of digital, as we heard in the previous presentation, technologies, and of course, finally, mobility. So, we do anticipate that local authorities are going to have to think much more about what goes in their local policies around some of these emerging themes. In the National Design Guide, there is very specific reference to movement, and related to that, to public space. So we acknowledge the key principles in there. I think there are 3 key themes in the National Design Guide, and they follow the themes of safety, accessibility, inclusivity, active travel, a real emphasis around that in the guidance notes, how spaces between buildings can be used for social interaction, the health and well-being implications of those spaces. And now, of course, the landscape features, and with government putting much more emphasis on street trees and on landscape within streets that, of course, help with air quality and with noise mitigation, as well as the more visual benefits of green canopies and so forth. So some real sort of guidance, or very clear, direct guidance about what is important within the within design quality as an issue. And put all together, all 10 characteristics, I would say is equivalent to the beauty aspect, or the beauty word, which of course creates some frowned eyebrows, furrowed brows in terms of issues to do with design quality. So my preference is using the word quality, design quality, rather than beauty, but these all add up to it. So local design codes are a requirement now, and stressed within the NPPF as a requirement, and of course the National Model Design Code and the guidance notes that support that came out at the end of January. We've gone through a consultation period on that as well, alongside the NPPF changes. We had significant interest, I would say, and we're in the process of strengthening some of the requirements, rejigging some of the words, and making sure that it sort of matches our aspiration for it to deliver real quality. So what's it about? It really is for local planning authorities to produce local design codes for their area. Our government wants, our government ministers want to ensure that all local planning authorities use codes, guidance, or have policies for design in their local plans and as SPDs. They're intended to capture the views of local community, and I'll talk more about that. But generally speaking, I mean, the guidance notes, if you read it, just captures good urban design principles. Of course, co-produced with URBED. This wasn't something that government just sort of outsourced to a private consultancy with URBED. It was very much co-produced and co-written by the design team, by myself, alongside David and his team. That said, you know, we really valued the work that David and his team did on this particular piece of work. So the design parameters which are included within coding are set out here. It's not intended that all codes should include all of these requirements. It is a checklist, if you like, of what should be in a code. It is really going to be entirely down to what local places apply in their local codes or guides. It needs to be applicable to the local circumstances. So some of these parameters are essential. Some of them are a recommendation to consider. Some of them are even things that you might put in policies as opposed to in a code. So, but it serves as a really good checklist, in my view, of the things that need to be considered as part of the coding process. How do we apply it? There's a section within the National Model Design Code about application. And again, this is all going to be down to how this is determined locally. We're going through at the moment a process of testing the coding work with 14 places across the country, a representative in each of the regions. We'll be able to announce who they all are after the local elections, but at the moment it's business as usual in terms of taking that forward. But interestingly, some of them are at a very large scale in terms of county level, and what can counties do to underpin what local authorities or parish councils in their area might be delivering, either in terms of local plans or neighbourhood plans. So it can be at that scale, it can be at local authority scale, it can be at site scale, or even down to plot. So this is really something that is intended to be determined at a local level. And what's the purpose of it? I guess it's really for local planning authorities to prepare these codes, but done in collaboration with developers and landowners, which we think is important in terms of delivering real deliverable coding work that won't challenge viability or deliverability. Where do the highways authorities sit within this? As I mentioned right at the beginning, such a big issue in terms of getting the spaces between buildings right. And highways authorities clearly will need to be engaging with planning authorities in terms of determining what goes in a code. But if in the future manual for streets becomes the default guidance, which is the intention of government at the moment, that might in itself be a resolution. I mention about strategic infrastructure at this point because I do believe that there might be some expectation that in some way this guidance, this coding addresses how places themselves are connected. There are a couple of principles I think that are important here. One is that the coding guidance that we've given doesn't actually sort of imply how to allocate sites or how those sites might indeed be connected. That is a matter for the local plan and perhaps a more regional approach and a more strategic approach by the local authority. But the coding work doesn't necessarily in itself address either of those 2 points. I've heard a lot from Tim about digital, and the coding work in itself would be really benefited from, or would really benefit from GIS mapping and bringing together all the information relevant to an area, which might be in different layers and covering these different aspects. So good baseline information, context studies, understanding the context being so important to delivering what then might become a vision for an area. So it's not just what an area is like now, but what an area might be like into the future. So we use area types at the moment, which I'll come on to talk about. And one area type might be of a current type, but it might actually aspire to be something different into the future. So the coding work actually helps you to identify what those opportunities might be. They're worksheets that enable you to assess and project what an area type might be into the future. The coding plan, we're talking to places at the moment in the piloting about how you might map different area types in a town plan or a city plan, so that areas of a similar character are sort of identified. And at the moment there are about 10 that we've identified, but places are coming forward saying, well, we've got more than 10 or we've got less than 10. So there might be other characteristics of these types typical of towns and cities in the country. The next stage for any allocated site within that plan would be to then set out a master plan. We're all familiar with how master plans might sit together, but clearly in terms of large strategic sites, it's important that these have some kind of formal structure or some parameters or design constraints which determine how sites might be put forward. And this could easily be done with the support of landowners and developers, or it could be done by the local authority with good skills internally. The area types that we've identified, and we just sort of picked out 3 quite randomly here, ought to have, in our view, some clear parameters. There ought not to be ambiguity, it ought not to be just aspirational. There ought to be some clear design parameters to work within, measurable, able to be identified very clearly in terms of what the metrics might be, and how to define it. And we've actually set out here some examples of what we call settings might be for different area types. There's guidance on what that might be. So in those guidance notes in the code itself, There's suggestions about what are the key parameters that need to be thought about. This is a page which actually sets out some of the issues to do with streets, with parking, with cycle, with junctions, and so on. So we're not in the code actually setting out a requirement. We're setting out things that need to be considered and referencing it back to the guidance notes, which give good practice ideas for how to deal with different conditions. Code-wide guidance. This is a sort of, you know, there might not be an area type, but there might be a code which covers a number of area types. And so there might be issues which are overarching for all area types. For example, nature, green infrastructure, water, biodiversity would apply across all area types. So guidance could be applied to that. I won't go into detail on the guidance notes. It's such a big document. I'm sure you've all caught sight of it. It's well illustrated, really clear balance between text and illustration, picks out all the key points that ought to be thought about, and is not prescriptive. So, for example, the issue around what buildings look like is heavily sort of caveated about principles as opposed to styles of architecture, which we felt was really important to observe. And in that particular guidance is a whole sheet on street typologies, which we've discussed with the Manual for Streets team and DFT, made sure that we're getting the language right, making sure that the issues around good urban design are factored in terms of enclosure ratios, in terms of heights of buildings around spaces, and so on. So a real sort of good reference manual for and a checklist of things to consider for good urban design. I mean, my overall view of this is that it becomes almost an addendum or the next step in what good urban design is when set out in the Urban Design Compendium. Instead of being aspirational in principle, it actually gives some very specific guidance on good urban design. And here I just listed out those that are relevant to movement and public space and the issues that we've covered within those guidance notes. Where we've said in public about the use of the National Design Guide and the National Model Design Code being used to make decisions, there are some clear paragraphs that can be cited here if a scheme or an application coming forward doesn't meet a specific requirement that's included, or undershoots it, or is not addressing it at all. The guide and the code work can actually be referenced as something that demonstrates that an application could be bettered or improved. A word or two about community engagement. The whole of the design code is premised on using community engagement as the foundation for developing coding work. This is obviously a new sort of move in terms of helping three-dimensional models to come forward early in planning processes. And how do you get that democracy brought forward, as is the catchphrase, so that there is genuine community engagement in developing codes. And part of our piloting process is now looking at how do we get that buy-in from communities, what's the best way of approaching it. Clearly we're facing a bit more of a challenging time in terms of face-to-face engagement, but we have found anecdotally that there's been significant more interest in planning applications coming forward due to the digital engagement over the last year or two. And we hope to capture some of that in terms of enabling more diverse groups, more hard to reach groups, or those who are often not listened to because they're not engaging in the face-to-face processes. How do we get those people more involved? And there is this whole issue about how do you demonstrate that the code work does actually meet the community's aspirations. So just sort of finally from me on coming back to the beginning, really, that the spaces between buildings issue is almost one of the most fundamental issues in terms of what we need to address into the future, and getting these sort of spaces right. I think the Building for a Healthy Life, which we now reference in the NPPF, is a good visual tool to demonstrate whether spaces, whether designs coming forward are actually meeting some of these aspirations. And it's something that government finds probably more difficult to do, because it identifies very specific culprits and places that are getting it wrong, as well as those that are getting it right. So this sort of is really where we need to be at. We need to move away from those with the red cross to those with the green ticks in terms of much better outcomes, not just in terms of spaces between buildings, but in terms of the creation of placemaking, quality design, quality buildings, all in all. That's it from me. John, back to you.
Thank you very much, Andy. That's really good. I've had one question or a series of questions from one person about the criteria for quality and the levels of importance of those criteria. Are they all equal? Are some more important than others, and so on and so forth? So I'm wondering whether you could just go through some of you had the wheel of the 3 C's, I think, with the 10 items on them, whether those are worth going through just to sort of say, are they all of equal importance, or are some more important than others?
I'll share my screen.
And also with that, to just talk about what we might call soft urban design, which is the sort of support mechanisms, the invisibles.
Yeah, okay. Let me just share my screen again and talk this through. Maybe could have done with talking that. Can you see that?
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe I should have spoken a little bit more about what the criteria are. In the 10 characteristics of well-designed places, piece of work that we did in the National Design Guide that Tibbles helped us with, so ought to name check Tibbles for their work on this. I'll just go through the 10 because I think they're important. And first of all, starting with the context, i.e., have we considered carefully enough the context? And all good urban designers, architects do this anyway. But a lot of places that you see around the country just simply ignore context and are sort of dropped into a location with no consideration of materials, typologies, architecture, vernacular, call it what you will, history, historic influences, heritage. All of those issues become really important in terms of context. And if there's one thing that the government probably is really passionate about, is this whole issue about how places add character to existing places. So I'd prioritize that particular one. Identity is probably should come after built form, but it's clearly another issue for government. I think this word beauty has sort of rather crept into the lexicon informally now in the NPPF. So how do we identify, how does identity, character, you might call, of development sort of get defined? Built form, obviously a part of identity in a sense, creating a 3-dimensional form and creating space between buildings, how movement works between that built form. Nature, a really significant aspect at the moment, and if there's any one or two issues, one is the nature emergence, or the nature emergency, you might call it, and the climate emergency, and both of those are reflected in the wheel. Resources is covering the environmental issues. Public space, uses, and making sure that there's a good mix of uses, good mix of tenures, homes and buildings and how they're designing, the quality of internal spaces within homes and buildings, another important aspect. And then finally, and very importantly, this soft issue that you mentioned about how places then are not just made to last, but also managed over time. So it's great having good buildings, but if they don't get looked after and they don't get invested in, stewardship and the management and maintenance of and making things built to last and age gracefully, that's covered in there. So those are the 10 characteristics. In terms of weight, context, nature, environment, and movement are probably, public spaces are probably the really key issues for us at the moment.
Thanks, that's really good. You mentioned ubiquity. I think, you know, the sort of the standard product that comes out of the volume builder, which is what you're fighting against, and yet you're not necessarily putting in place something that would guide them in terms of their business model and their supply chain, which is one of the issues that we are facing. They have enormous power. They have the land, or a lot of the land, and they are geared to a particular approach, which is not necessarily in the common, in the common good, for which the government is to be praised for this particular set of codes. So how do we get that side of things moving? Is anybody talking to them? Are they?
Yeah. So two things there, John. One is that firstly, the Home Builders Federation are engaging positively in this. They have a Future Homes Task Force, which is looking at some of the issues to do with the environmental impact on housing design. Clear aspiration through the Future Homes Standard to up the standard of new homes. And I think recognition by the Home Builders Federation that that's something they need to positively engage with. Alongside that, they've included this issue around quality of design, beauty, call it what you will. So they see that as part of a sort of a requirement for them to change and to up their game a bit. I mean, I have to say that within house building, there are good guys and there are bad guys, and we all know who they are. And it's a question of not painting them all, tarring them all the same brush. We all know why they produce standard types that get rolled out across the country. We understand that particular dynamic. But I think they realise that we are serious about this, and the government is not going to let go of it, and it's holding them to task. But I think it's less about what house builders do, and much more to do with what local authorities now are able to do if they have the confidence, the skill, the resources available to them. They are able to set aspiration for their area, which if you have a local authority that has that confidence, I suppose, to do it, it can determine what gets built in its area is going to be an enhancement to its place, and what communities want has to be sort of bedded into that. So it should be for local authorities really to up their game too, but clearly they need the skills and the resources to do that. And coding is the mechanism for achieving it. Okay,
I'm just just thinking about what Tim was saying before. I don't know whether you're still there, Tim, but Tim was saying there before.
I'm here. I'm still here.
Vast deserts of suburbs, which are miles away from everything that they need, with no definitions whatsoever. So I'm just wondering how we avoid that, especially in the areas of great growth.
Tim, I don't know whether you want to come in on that. It's up to me.
Happy to follow you, Andy.
Do you want to put your video on, Tim?
I've had to move location, so I won't, if that's all right.
I won't ask where.
Okay.
Well, look, we're all faced with these challenges. It's not something that's going to be magicked overnight. I mean, new development coming forward, though, is going to be faced with greater scrutiny if design codes are produced by local councils, and if the coding work is implemented, say, in a reform planning system, which is clearly the government's ambition. Local authorities will have much more power in determining how and what comes forward in their area. So we should be seeking to avoid that sort of uniform lack of centre, lack of identity, lack of character, and create walkable, accessible, sustainable neighbourhoods. So that's the aspiration. And again, I say it again, design code should be the tools for achieving that.
I've got another question here from Richard Etoff. Are you still there, Richard? Do you want to unmute yourself? Or shall I ask it for you?
Hi, John. What was my question? Can't remember.
The requirement for local planning authorities to do their own coding.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Yeah, I might have. I thought that's what I heard. I don't know where it was. The situation in Reading is we've got experiences of design codes. In as much as we've had them from developers. I think I even worked with yourself, John, about 15 years ago on design coding, when we dealt with it in an SPD on part of West Reading. We've got a number of other initiatives going on. We've just employed our first urban design, conservation and urban design officer. This just feels like a step too far for us, and we're not planning it at the moment. If we're told we have to do it, can I just find out where it is, please? That's the question.
Did you get that?
No, so I slightly missed the tail end of it, John. Can you sort of fill me in a bit?
Well, I'll try it because it was a bit difficult. I think what she was saying is that they've tried codes before and it's been partially successful, or, but the skills and the resources are not necessarily there.
Yeah.
So what happens now? How do they do that? And, to get developers to do their own coding is not exactly the way forward.
Yeah. I mean, I think the whole issue around resourcing skills and, the pressure that local authorities are under at the moment is not ignored. We recognise that, and we are looking at how places can be supported. So Office for Place, which is an organisation that again was announced at the beginning of the year by the Minister, is intended to provide a level of support to local authorities, guidance, or more direct interventions, if you like, if it depends really how Office for Place then is set up. So that's one mechanism. We're doing pilots across the country.
Sorry, can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
Is this like a sort of Ofsted SWAT team that comes in and sits with the local authority to make things happen?
I don't think it's an Ofsted type thing at all. I think it's completely different to that. It's intended to be a sort of a support for rolling out design codes as one issue. But clearly the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission report recommended some things, and this organisation, when it's set up, is intended to help roll out some of those aspects. Right. But I wouldn't make a comparison with any kind of oversight body that polices. It's much more a sort of research body. How do you do things well? How do you transfer good practice from one place to another? I think with in answer to the gentleman from Reading, I can well understand that some local authorities think this is a big ask, and that, you know, having the skills or the resources available to them is a challenge. But I have to say that the design network community, you know, those organisations that sort of provide design review, provide design advice to local authorities, are really gearing up to help with sort of disseminating information, providing support. So Urban Design London, for example, has just opened up a coding school for any local authority that wishes to engage with it. So we are seeing more engagement with on this particular theme, and more support. But it doesn't take away from the fundamental point that local authorities need more resources and skills to deliver this. Thank you.
Tim, are you still available?
I am. I would just add to what Andy's just said, that what I was showing was a platform in the Active Travel Explorer, which is intended to try to accelerate the quantification of some of the aspects that are in the new model design code. So how can you measure connectivity really easily? How can you predict movement really easily? And how can you do that in a way that has a low barrier of entry in terms of specialist training, so that in fact there should be no specialist training. Therefore, you don't have to send officers off on special planning training courses. You just go through a checklist. And I think that's the interesting discussion going forward, because the new model design code has in it the best principles of decades of good urban design research and practice. It's all the stuff that is what the urban design community is trying to achieve. Challenge is, how do you quantify it? How do you put metrics to the codes? And that's a bit that we're playing our part in when it comes to issues of connectivity. It's the bit which, in terms of the future, we're trying to develop tools around how do you do that in terms of massing as well. How do you build in topography? How do you build in other issues relating to climate and so on? And I think the next decade will see a fertile flourishing of tools that can help to, I think, address the question at the heart here, which is, this is all great, but how do we afford it, and how do we afford not just the money but the time to invest in delivering it?
Yeah. Can I just ask Jill, if she's there, to just carry on the conversation that she's started with you? Jill, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm here, John. Conversation, I can't recall. What did I start? About about places, lack of understanding how people behave. Was that my comment?
Yeah.
I was saying,
started in the chat shows. That's right. And
yeah, no, because Tim talked about, and I have a slight criticism of, architectural students aren't trained to understand human behavior. Well, I'm not quite sure that that's the case. But surely, we need to think about human needs and the changing human needs, and particularly now that the pandemic's driven changing human behavior in terms of how people live and how people work, and all those things need to come into housing design, and making houses so they're flexible, that cope with multi-generational families. It goes back, it was done in the 60s, but actually we need to think about what do houses and places where houses are need to be in a much more fundamental way. That's the question I ask. And how are we going to get local authorities and housing developers and everybody to come forward with these the ideas, so that the places will actually work?
Okay, and so that's a typological change as well as everything else. How do we rethink the component parts of our built environment? Tim, do you want to just take that on?
Yeah, and Jill, I was slightly disparaging about architects, and that's only because I am one. I wouldn't be slightly disparaging about any other profession that I didn't know as well. And of course, it's not in its entirety that the profession is inadequate in its understanding of human behavior, but I continue to see it. I see it in schools of architecture. I was trained in that manner. It was all about aesthetics and construction technique, and those are important, what it looks like and how you build it, but how it then works is also important. That's the missing dimension that we and others are trying to close. And that's why the work of Jan Gale is so important, and Holly White and Jane Jacobs and Bill Hilliard. So there should be more of it. That's really what I was trying to say. When it comes to living with COVID, I agree completely. We need new forms, but in many ways, I think what COVID has done is to accelerate the need for change anyway, to remove car dependence and to make it easier to walk, cycle, take public transport to your place of work. Then, of course, your place of work is like my place of work, and I imagine many of us on this call right now, it's home. You know, it's just the kitchen's over there, and so on. Our homes have become offices, and so we need to be building in the flexibility to live. Of course, that on the one hand might suggest we need to build bigger houses. Maybe we just need to build better houses. And what the house building industry needs to do is to stop churning out the same old box and start thinking a bit more creatively. That also, I think, means in the more sophisticated, I wouldn't call them house builders, I'd call them placemakers. The more sophisticated developers are building units that can be converted one way or the other, either into business as places grow and there's a greater need for local jobs, or into housing if there's a downturn in the market. And planning needs to be sophisticated to acknowledge these changes can happen in both directions.
Can I come in here, John, as well? I mean, I agree with all of that. And I think we are, I use the word existential deliberately, really, because, you know, we are in a completely different situation with climate change, with technological change, and with behavioural change that comes with that. I would argue that architects are not really sort of so geared up for some of these changes that they need to be. So there is something about how this is brought through the education system for architects, and I think even the RIBA is sort of acknowledging some of these issues. And I think it's how do we encourage behavioural change in a sense, because at the end of the day, it's all down to the behaviour of individuals. And the role of architects is to help shape their environment, and by shaping their environment, shaping behaviour.
Well, on that positive note, I think I'm going to call a halt to this webinar. That's really good, and thank you very much, both of you, for the talks that you've given, and also the way that you answered the questions. We appreciate that very much. I'm going to hand over to Maura now, and thank you all, by the way, for all of those of you who've been listening in for your attendance. That's much appreciated. So I'm going to hand over to Maura now, who will tell you a little bit more, I hope, about what's coming up next on Bob. Okay, thank you very much. Maura?
Thank you, John. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Tim. Yes, hi, everybody. So we haven't got any fixed dates in the diary yet, although we do have 3 webinars in process of planning. One all about climate change, one about landscape, and then a final one about child-friendly cities. And so I will send you further details when they're all in place. We're also looking at doing some work on what is an architect, what is a tree officer, what is an urban designer, and looking at all these different roles so people are really quite clear as to what the function of some of these roles are that they might be dealing with regularly. And just sort of understanding how, you know, people work together in local authorities. So it'd be interesting to understand, if you'd be interesting to hear about, you know, what is the role of a landscape architect, for example. And, you know, the more interest we have in identifying some of these, you know, we can pull together a short event just to have a focus on, you know, what some of these people do. I think it's been great today. We've got lots of people talking and lots of networking going on. So It's been a great event today.
We've got a coffee morning, haven't we?
We have, yeah. So we're trialing a coffee morning as well, looking at street design. So we've got some of the steering group coming to that to look at shorter meetings and more interactive and more discussed meetings where everyone can get involved. So we'll hopefully be able to roll that out further if that's a success. Our first one's on May the 11th. So I sent you a feedback form, so if you can feed back to me or email me, that would be great.
And will the slides be available? Will the recordings and the slides be available?
I'm not sure. Andy, are we able to use your slides? Tim, can we use your slides?
I can send you something that's probably a little bit more full, which is a film, which we can share with you, which gives a very official sort of position about all this stuff. So I'll send you a link to the film, Maura.
Brilliant.
Thank you. And Tim's probably gone off to the train station.
No, I'm still within my 7-minute window. No, I'm very happy for the slides to be shared. And in fact, I'll just put a Dropbox link into the chat now if anybody wants to grab it, so that you can do that.
Yes, Maura, perhaps you will send the links that Tim has put down in the chat room to everybody who has been present today as well.
Yeah, links, movies, everything we've got. Yeah, I'll get that over to you in the next few days, plus a little bit of detail of what's coming up with Bob MK.
Good. Have we got any design reviews coming up, by the way?
Nothing booked in.
We had a very big one recently, didn't we? On one of the garden cities or the garden towns.
Yeah, and we need to probably be doing a few more of those now as well, don't we? So if anyone's got any design reviews or any design requirements, you know where we are.
Thank you very much, Maura.
No problem. Thank you all, and see you all again soon.